Hello, Shelties. Welcome to the Management and Record Keeping section of the ASV Guidelines Second Edition Reboot Camp. Management and record keeping. Really, the scope and focus of this section is the organization at a kind of high level in terms of how the organization is set up and how policies and protocols are put into place. And so called out pretty quickly that shelters must have a clearly defined mission or mandate, must have adequate personnel, up-to-date policies and protocols, a system for training and supervising personnel, and management practices aligned with these guidelines. So regardless of the size of an organization or the limits of its mission or scope or geographic service, all of these pieces and parts are super important to making sure that the organization communicates both internally and externally what their role is in the community and how they function as an organization. Another piece of this is decision making. How do organizations make decisions? And so it's fairly common if you ask a group of people engaged in sheltering or animal rescue what's most important in making decisions, they will focus in on the animal and the animal's well-being, animal welfare, and that is important. But for organizations, it's also important to keep in mind the health and well-being of the people involved, both within the organization and within the community, and then also the organization overall, its financial, social health. And so all three of those things are important to making sure that decisions happen in a systematic and appropriate manner. And so decision-making must take into account resource allocation, as well as population and individual animal health and welfare. There we see the start of language about that interconnectedness between individual level care and decisions and population level care and decisions, which is sort of the foundation of shelter medicine practice. And then that decisions involving the allocation of resources, regardless of the level that they're at, are best made by personnel aware of the organization's priorities and the shelter's capacity for care. That we really need to be making decisions that create a sustainable sort of environment for our people, our animals, and our community. And resources do matter. The guiding principle for the guidelines is always animal well-being. But in terms of the bigger picture, we've got to keep in mind all those other pieces and parts that play such an important role in our day-to-day operations. When it comes to the role of veterinarians in animal shelters, this version of the guidelines also speaks to making sure that there is a formal relationship in place with a veterinarian to ensure oversight of medical and surgical care in the shelter. Now, that role can look very different. This is not to say that every shelter has to employ a veterinarian. There needs to be a relationship. And so that role may be at the level of a board member or a volunteer. It may be agreements or contracts with private practices or contracts with individuals, or then certainly it may be at the level of an employee. But it should be clear within the organization the internal and external roles of that veterinarian and that veterinarian's responsibilities, and that this is a very clear and formal relationship. We do know that this is a big step for some organizations, particularly smaller organizations. We also recognize that the expectation for the level of care that we are providing for animals in shelters has certainly grown over the years. And so this is a way of clarifying what that role is, what that connection is with that veterinarian, and to be sure that there are policies and protocols in place of which that veterinarian is aware. In addition to looking at the roles of veterinarians in animal shelters and those formal relationships, there's also the element of the definition of veterinary practice. In the US, veterinary practice is driven very much by state practice acts. And so this can be very different depending on where you're working. It's certainly a combination of both regulations in terms of what's legal, but also overarching policies and position statements. And so there's this interconnectedness for what does veterinary practice actually look like in a shelter. We did reach for the AVMA Model Practice Act, which is what states look at in designing their practice acts. And that does have language that allows for establishing a veterinary client-patient relationship and oversight of populations through timely visits to the premises and standard written protocols. And so that language is very representative of how we practice medicine in shelter settings, and to some degree matches how veterinarians practice medicine in other types of population settings. And so a shelter's veterinarian must have knowledge about their population. And so if you have that formal relationship in place, it is important that the shelter's veterinarian does know about the animals in that organization's care. And again, timely visits through husbandry and knowing how they're cared for, and then through protocols, which they have reviewed and potentially in some cases helped create. And then in terms of that shelter veterinarian's training, they should have training or experience in shelter medicine. And so the opportunities for training or continuing education in shelter medicine have grown dramatically in the past decade. And this can range from core shelter medicine textbooks, which now exist, to online or in-person continuing education opportunities. There's formal coursework in shelter medicine, and now there's board certification in shelter medicine through ABVP. And so it is not the expectation that every veterinarian working in shelters has completed coursework or board certification, but it is the expectation that they can reach for some basic resources and training in the field. And so this is something that we would see as a should to provide veterinarians, even those who potentially are in contract relationships or in private practice settings, provide them with some population level expertise so that they can engage with the shelter on more of a population level instead of just an individual animal care level. And speaking about protocols, we love them in shelter medicine. And so this section also provides an Appendix B item for core shelter protocols that every shelter should have. And the expectation is that the shelter's veterinarian should be consulted on all the policies and protocols related to the maintenance of medical and behavioral animal health. And so this is a nice place to start if you're looking at your protocol list to say, do we have the core shelter protocols that we should in place? And if not, these are things we can start working on now to make sure that we have protocols that represent these key operational elements. Veterinary technicians and paraprofessionals. This is a hot topic in the U.S. And although we don't have a guideline statement on it, we do have supporting text. So shelters can maximize capacity for medical services by utilizing veterinary technicians and other veterinary professionals to the extent of their capabilities. Protocol-based medicine in shelter practice really speaks to training staff and providing protocols that they can then use to provide direct care under the supervision of a veterinarian. And we very much need our veterinary paraprofessionals, our veterinary technicians, in order to do our jobs. And to make sure that the animals are gaining access to care. This section also speaks to personnel training and that shelters must provide training for each shelter task. The personnel must demonstrate skills and knowledge before we assume proficiency, and training must be documented. And when licensing or certification is required to perform specialized duties, the personnel performing those tasks must be credentialed, which again means we are meeting the legal and regulatory requirements of the jurisdiction in which we operate. And that is a core basic guideline throughout this document. Telemedicine, another hot topic. And again, we don't have a guideline statement, but we do have supporting text that providing veterinary care via telemedicine extends veterinary bandwidth and can improve animal welfare. There are many places in shelter medicine practice in which telemedicine serves both animals and people. And so important to keep an eye on the ASV position statements. That is an area where we would expect to continue to see some work on this topic. Record keeping, everyone's favorite topic. And so given that technology has also increased tremendously in the past decade, digital systems should be used for record keeping. Preferably, we like software that's designed for animal shelters. And the key here is that the software system needs to be able to generate population level reports as well as individual animal records. And so Shelter software programs have grown tremendously. We have many options. They have various strengths and weaknesses in terms of both individual level record keeping and then population based reporting. But the emphasis is that we should continue to utilize these programs to the extent of their capabilities, and that making sure we can access population reports is essential. So finally, guidelines versus laws versus statutes. Shelters are obligated to comply with all local, state, and national regulations. That is an underarching principle that goes throughout this document. However, existing regulations can represent outdated practice or lower standards of care, and at times existing regulations can conflict with the current best practices in shelter medicine. So when implementation of these guidelines does not align with government regulations, shelters are encouraged to support endeavors for legislative change. This is a rapidly changing field, and it's important that we keep at the core animal well-being. And at times that means that the regulations and laws will need to be adjusted. Again, I call out the ASV position statements where we often take on timely issues and provide support for changes to rules and regulations that may be impeding your practice. So download your copy today. Thank you very much.